Welcome to the walkthrough of the frequently made mistakes for assignment 4B. First and foremost, as usual, please make sure to thoroughly document your code. There were lots of people who wrote stuff that made no sense, but I couldn't really understand what the intent was, so make sure you get in the habit of always documenting your code no matter what. Let's take a look at some problems that occurred with the apply transform methods, both in the main controller.java file and the main service.java file for the server portion of assignment 4B. You need to make sure you put the right annotations here. This particular piece of code is missing the overall annotation for the apply transform method, so therefore Spring won't recognize it as an endpoint method for the controller. And you're also missing annotations down here, especially one for the multi-part file, which is very important, as well as for the transforms, which is the list. This code also won't compile. This implementation won't compile because the parameter that's passed to collect is incorrect. I recommend you use a simpler method anyway, but if you do use collect, make sure that you pass the right parameter there to make it collect it into a list. There's another problem here where this annotation for the multi-part file is incorrect, so make sure you have that correct. You should be able to see that from, I think assignment number 2 has something along those lines that you can mimic, assuming you got that right for assignment number 2. Now let's take a look at some other problems with apply transforms. This particular code doesn't handle the parallel parameter at all. There's no parallel processing under any circumstance here. And it's also using the wrong operator for the call to build microservice URL and also the call to post request. The wrong operator is being called. So make sure you fix that. And there's also no need to call collect since this particular method returns a flux. And moreover, this call to collect is incorrect because it doesn't provide the right parameter. But you don't need to have collect here at all. Let's take another look at a problem. This apply transforms method is incorrect. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't follow the specification in the comments that are in the skeleton. So not quite sure what's going on here, but it's the wrong place to put it, and it's just plain incorrect entirely. Let's take a look at another problem a lot of people had. Please make sure that you refactor your code so there's no duplication of methods. And there's a couple ways to do this. Probably the easiest way and the cleanest way to do it is to simply define a local variable of type flux string and then assign it properly using from iterable and then conditionally using subscribe on if the parallel parameter is set to true. So I'll let you kind of think about how you do that. Also, there's no reason or it's incorrect to use schedulers.single. That doesn't do what you think it does. That means it'll run in a background single thread, which is not what we want. We want it to run in the calling thread, and therefore you shouldn't be using subscribe on at all if the parallel Boolean parameter is false. Continuing on, here's some more problems. This code doesn't match the specification comment above, so that's just incorrect. It's calling the wrong method in the wrong place. And likewise, the subscribe on method, there is no scheduler sequential method, so you need to refactor this code, as I mentioned above, in order to kind of hoist out the initialization of the flux local variable to be properly set to parallel under the right conditions. Here's some more problems. This, again, is not how you have a flux run in parallel. You need to use subscribe on. There is, in fact, a .parallel method in Flux, but it is used to create a parallel flux, which is not what we're trying to do here in the least. We're trying to use subscribe on instead. And don't be calling map not null. That's the wrong method to call here. You need to think about what's the right method to call, and you have to think about how you're going to flatten the results that come back from build microservice URL, or the result that comes back from that. Let's look at some more problems here with apply transforms. As you can see, it's got a lot of challenges. Don't use new parallel, since that's really the wrong method to call. That requires you to write extra code to dispose of the result handle that comes back from that, because it's not automatically set to be a daemon thread, so you'd have to explicitly delete it or dispose of it. And also, there is no new sequential method, so again, you can't do that. I'm not quite sure what this is trying to do, but make sure you refactor the code as per my comments above. As earlier, don't use map here. It's the wrong operator to call for both this context and that context. And again, please refactor this code so the subscribe on isn't in the main flux chain, but instead it would appear first and only if the parallel parameter is set. So you have to, I would recommend, there's various ways to do this, but my recommended way would be to make a local variable of type flux string and then set it appropriately. Yet more problems here. Again, don't be calling subscribe on unilaterally in the chain. That'll cause problems. In this particular case, I'm not even sure what this is trying to do, but it's not going to compile. And so you'll have some problems. So refactor things, please. Now it's finally time to move on to some other problems in the main service file, main service.java. And post request, there's a bunch of problems with that. This is the wrong method to call in post request. Post for entry, I believe, is something that is intended to be used with the REST template rather than with the web client. And this is the wrong method to call here. You need to pass the map to the body of the post request. That's a different method to use. If you watch the videos where I walk through some programming examples for WebFlux, you'll see how to do it. And I think this is a syntax error since there's a parameter omitted from body to mana. You have to tell what class you want to have it have the body transformed into. Down here we have similar problems. This particular implementation doesn't meet the specification comment that's above, the comment which has the specification in it. We're calling REST template post for entity. That's not what's intended to be used. We need to be able to use web client and the various methods that it defines. And down here, this does use some of the web client methods, but it's incomplete. There's a bunch of stuff that's missing that has to be added. Otherwise, you won't be able to get the result back, and you won't be able to pass the map in the body. Another problem, this code won't compile, and it really makes no sense. Again, it's some weird mixture of REST template and things that REST template does, so that's not designed to be used with WebFlux. That's intended to be used with WebMVC. Now let's move on to one problem I saw in get transform microservices. Most people got that right, so that was good, but this particular code simply won't compile since it's incomplete. Now we're turning our attention to the transform controller and transform service portion of the code. This particular example has the constructor of transform service not properly initializing all the various transforms. This is missing tint and sepia, so make sure you do that. This particular code here is missing some key annotations. It doesn't have the right annotation here for the apply transform method to make it an endpoint method, endpoint in the controller, and it's also not handling the multi-part file parameter correctly. Now we get into the implementation of the transform service, and here's apply transform. Make sure that when get returns null, you throw an exception like illegal argument exception if there's nothing that matches the transform name. If someone passes in a junk transform name, you should catch that error. You flag that error and catch an exception, or throw an exception rather, in that particular case. And then down here, there's also some stuff missing because you have to make the appropriate transformed image, and that's not being done in this code, and that needs to return as the parameter. So those were some of the key problems I saw with the server skeletons portion of assignment 4B. Let's now turn our attention to the client skeletons portion. These are things that are kind of either left over from assignment 4A or things that weren't done that were added in assignment 4B. So this particular code here for images on page and page links async doesn't implement the comment specifications above. You're supposed to be calling a different method here than using just. That won't do anything that you want it to do. A surprisingly large number of people pass the wrong parameter to get page elements as strings in the images on page async method. If you think about what we're looking for images, not pages. So that should give you a big hint as to what parameter to be passed here. And make sure you pass a parameter. Don't just leave an empty parameter as is done here. This type of mistake should be getting caught by the unit tests. So if it's not getting caught by the unit tests, please let me know because they need to be expanded to cover that. Now we're turning our attention to a problem that I saw a lot of people do in transform image remotely. You need to make sure that you're correctly initializing these fields, the multi-part body part field, which is called image part, and then the list string, which is called transform names. Those things need to be initialized by making the right calls to helper methods. And this particular code also won't compile, and it won't match the comment specifications that are above. So you have to rethink how to do this, and I'll give you some hints. You need to be able to use the API, local variable, and you need to kind of expand things to handle the parameters that are flowing through this particular sequence of chain calls off of the flux. So that was essentially the summary of frequently made mistakes that I saw for assignment 4B. There were also a number of people who just didn't do large chunks of the assignment. So make sure that you take some time and fix things properly so that you can pass the tests. I will be putting out new auto-grader tests here shortly, so you should be able to see for all your assignments what your grade will be. So make sure you run those things before you submit your final submission.